Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Azera, the U.S. Energy Administration's Director of State and Intergovernmental Outreach. And I want to thank you all for joining us today to discuss the expansion of the EIA Form 914 survey. I have a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's presentation should last between 45 minutes to an hour, and we would ask that you hold all inquiries until the end of the presentation. As Emily just mentioned, at that time there will be three options for you to present your questions, and they will be discussed in depth at that point. Today we have Adam Szyminski, Administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and he will present the overview of EIA's proposed expansion of the EIA-914 survey. Following Adam's presentation, a number of subject matter experts are available to answer any questions that you might have regarding the survey and its expansion. Now, without further ado, here is Adam to review EIA's proposed changes to the EIA-914 survey.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. I understand that we have a number of participants from the IPAA, the Independent Petroleum Association, line with us this morning, and I wanted to thank you for your cooperation with EIA over the years in helping to improve our data, and in fact, I'm here to ask for your help in doing that again. I was actually a longtime member of the IPAA before I had to recuse myself from memberships in organizations like yours when I accepted the job at EIA. I worked for many years as a participant from the financial community and IPAA activities, and I was a very active member of the Supply and Demand Committee working on those issues within the organization, and have spoken to a number of IPA mid-year meetings and other activities like that. So I'm actually really happy to be here today to try to gain your confidence and cooperation in what we're doing. The EIA's collection of timely, reliable, and more granular oil and natural gas production data, I think, is really important. It'll help inform policymakers in looking at many of the issues that they have under consideration right now. On the oil side, EIA currently does not collect anything on the crude oil production data directly from operators. Basically, we rely on state government sources for most of our data. In some areas, we're relying on private consultants who also look at the state data, and they help us build out some of the things that we do. Although the states provide fairly timely and accurate data, there are examples within a number of the states where there are some serious lags and other data issues that we would hope to address in the proposal to expand the 914 survey. On this first slide, I'm not going to go through all of this, but basically we think that if we can get data from 19 states and the federal Gulf of Mexico for both oil and gas, and that's up from the 5 states and the GOM that we're currently collecting data from for natural gas, that we would have a lot of benefit associated with the improvement in this data collection. It would be timelier, be more transparent. We'd improve the overall coverage rate. We could help policymakers in debates that they're having right now on things like crude oil and condensate exports and so on. As far as the burden on respondents is concerned, we don't think it's going to be huge. Right now, there are almost 250 respondents to the monthly natural gas survey. That number would roughly double to 500 respondents, we think, in what we're proposing, and that's out of a universe of 10 or 12,000 producers. So we're not talking about a huge number of people who would be asked to cooperate in our survey. Some of the existing tools that we have to look at are inadequate. We have been working with the Groundwater Protection Council on something called the National Gateway that will provide some well-level data on oil and gas, but that's going to be subject to the same lags and consistency limitations that exist in the current state-based data. Just as an example, we've gotten a lot of compliments on the drilling productivity report that we're publishing every month now that provides current estimates of production of both oil and natural gas in 6 of the big basins, the Eagle Ford, the Permian, the Niobrara, the Bakken, Haynesville, and the Marcellus. But even that is estimates based on a compilation of state data. It's not really, we think the estimates are very good, but it is an estimate tool and not a survey. So what I would like to do, and I think I can do this pretty quickly, is roll through some of these issues for you and then get on to see what kinds of questions or comments you might have. This map shows the original 5 states and the Gulf of Mexico that were in the 914 natural gas production survey since we started it back in 2005. What we would do in the expanded 914, as I indicated, is add oil to that survey, boost the number of states that we would be covering, and that way deal with some of the reporting and lagging and completeness issues that exist in the state database. Just as an example, the lags vary from state to state, but some of them tend to be very large. Over the past a little over 2 years, final crude oil production for 19 states in the Gulf of Mexico was reported on average about 9 months after the end of the month for the survey, the survey month that you'd be interested in. And 9 months is, in that time period, I don't know about natural gas, but I would suspect that oil production would probably have been up 500,000 barrels a day. And we want to be able to tell, in a sense, the industry story. This is a huge success story in many ways for the companies and for the nation. And having that kind of lag in such a rapidly moving area just simply isn't allowing that full story to be told. In Texas, for example, it takes more than 2 years from the end of the month that you're surveying to get final data. There are issues, just as an example, in Texas, the gap between the initial reported value and the final reported value over the past few months looks like it's actually increasing a little bit, and our survey would be able to deal with issues like that. In some states, Michigan and Kentucky, just as examples here, there's a lot of volatility in the data that is reported by the state agencies, and we're not really convinced that the actual flow of oil in those states is as volatile as the data reporting. In Michigan, looking at this example, data from the Department of Environmental Quality and the Treasury Department in Michigan show different numbers, and so simply relying on the state data alone is problematic. If you go back to EIA's original survey, that map basically showed you that we were concentrating on states in the Gulf of Mexico area. Well, we of course did have Texas in there, and Texas oil and gas production clearly rising, but we don't have or didn't have Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is now one of the largest gas producing states in the country, and it's not included in the current 914 survey. In a similar vein, we are seeing oil production rising very rapidly, up over 1 million barrels a day now in North Dakota, and North Dakota is not in the 914 survey for natural gas, but clearly capturing a state like North Dakota in oil production data with the huge gains that are taking place there literally on a month-to-month basis, I think is very important for lots of different purposes. So this map shows the expanded area for the 914. You know, we sometimes say 20 states and areas, and sometimes we say 19 states in the Gulf of Mexico, so the 20 states is not a mistake here. That's 19 states and the Gulf of Mexico. We would be adding the states that ultimately would allow us to capture about 90% of the production of both oil and natural gas in the lower 48 states. The data that we get from Alaska on oil and natural gas production is pretty accurate and fairly timely, and Alaska would not have to be included in this sample. We would have a lot better idea if we were able to do this on crude oil and least condensate issues. As you know, with the recent decision by the Commerce Department on condensate exports in 2 cases, understanding where that crude oil and condensate fits in the scheme of things, I think would be very, very important to everybody that's involved in this business. Being able to quantify it, I think, would lead to a better understanding by policymakers of what I would think would actually be, at this point, the relatively limited nature of condensate production within the overall crude and condensate stream. Finally, I just wanted to sum up, and then I'd be happy to try to answer your questions, why we think that it makes sense to expand the 914. We would improve the timeliness of oil and gas production data. It would allow for more transparency in how the various data streams are composed, particularly in the oil area. The API gravity issue is one that I think is of great value in helping to understand all kinds of issues associated with the refining, transportation, refining, and potentially exports of oil. Improving the coverage, I think, makes a whole lot of sense, given the expanding geographic area of shale production for both oil and gas. And then finally, it would, I think, go a long way, the new collection method, which we would do electronically, with respondents having access to a web portal where data could be pretty easily submitted to EIA, would dramatically reduce the errors in data reporting. I'm convinced that EIA can do a lot of good in the reporting of this data, that would be a positive, not just to data geeks like those of us here at EIA and financial community people, but to policymakers who are struggling with questions that I think we can help shed light on and help them come to good, solid decisions. I'm not trying to prejudge what those decisions would be, but I would rather see policymakers struggle with the policy choices that they are making based on facts rather than guesses about what it really means. So with that, I'll stop and let's turn it back to Steve and the operator to coordinate a Q&A period. Thanks.
Emily, you could take field questions if there are any from the phone.
Okay. If you're on the line and would like to ask a question, you can dial *1 to put yourself into the queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point you can state your name and your question. If your question is answered before we get to you, dialing *1 a second time will take you back out of the queue. You can also send a note to presenters using the Notes tab on the right-hand side of your screen.
Emily, I'm going to take this first question from Jonathan Erie.
Okay.
If you report for one state, will your company need to report production in states where the production is very small?
So I'm going to be really happy if the staff here at EIA that's sitting in the room with me will jump in and answer this, but let me just try the short one as I understand it. We will probably do this in the same way that we're currently doing, similar to what we're doing in the natural gas production survey. It's a cutoff sample. We'll do 2 cutoff samples per state, one for oil, one for natural gas, and what that generally means is that the smaller producers, for the most part, are not going to be burdened by this, but I'm going to allow the staff to elaborate on the question. Who wants to do that?
Okay.
Gary Long.
Hi. Basically, the way the survey will work is that, like Adam said, there'll be 2 cutoff samples per state or area, one for oil, one for gas. The cutoff samples are designed to get about 85% coverage. And because of the wide range in production volumes amongst these states, the cutoff for gas in one state might be quite a bit higher than it is in another state. It's the same way for oil, but for oil we have an additional criteria in that if you have less than 500 barrels a day production for the lower 48, you won't be surveyed, at least not for oil. You might be surveyed for gas. And this will eliminate quite a number of small operators.
Gary, I'd go back to the idea that our 250 or so respondents now, I think the last time I saw this, it was 240 respondents for the natural gas EIA-914 survey, would go up to just a few respondents over 500, so it would essentially double. But that means that, if there are really 12,000 operators out there, and we think that number is roughly what the universe is, that means there's 11,500 who aren't reporting. So that the overwhelming proportion of independent operators are not going to be asked to respond to the survey.
Yeah, and I guess the short answer to the question is yes. If you are reporting in are selected, sampled in any state for either oil or gas, you'll report all your operated production in every state. And that's how we get to the 90% coverage or so that you saw on the earlier slide from the design of 85%. We ultimately end up with about 90% or so coverage because of that reporting those small volumes that you are not necessarily sampled for, but that you do operate.
You know, one of the other things that I'll add in here, and then we can go on to, I see a few more questions are coming in, is for the first few months that we're doing this, I think it is going to be a learning process for you as well as for EIA, and we don't anticipate penalties or anything else on late submissions or incomplete submissions until we actually work out the details of exactly how this is going to work. So I'm very open to working with you to ameliorate concerns as we go along in this process. Back to you, Stephen.
Emily, do you have any on the phone?
We do not at the moment.
Okay, then we have a second question from Bob Wilkinson. Can the reporting of oil and natural gas be kept separate to allow more flexibility and simplicity in submitting the reports?
Well, they are separate on the form, and I'm not sure what that question means. If you're talking about two separate reports, that was considered at one time, but
so we're thinking about that question as to what we would do. So as Gary said, there is an electronic form, and it's got spaces on it for oil production and natural gas production.
It's not BOE. It's separate oil and gas.
Right. So if the question is, would it make sense to have two forms, one form for oil and one form for natural gas, I don't know. Right. Separate, yes, separate reports. Well, I don't know. Let us think about that. I mean, I could see one advantage in terms of the timeliness of completing it if you thought you had better, faster oil data than you had gas, or vice versa. From our standpoint, there may be some advantages in streamlining this in one form submission, but if we're doing this electronically, maybe it doesn't really matter very much. So let us think about that. And Bob, why don't you get in touch with Jim Kendall and Gary Long and tell us why you think it would work better, or how you think it would work in your instance, and we'll try to see if we can generalize from that.
Emily, I will just address quickly the one question regarding a link for the webinar. We will try and provide one sometime after the presentation. I will send out a communication to the group once it's available. Do we have a call on the line?
Before we do that, this is John Crone. I just wanted to provide Gary an opportunity to provide his email address so that Bob can follow up with him with any additional insight.
His email address is gary.long@eia.gov. gary.long@eia.gov.
Emily, do we have a question on the phone?
We do.
Send them through.
Yep. Go ahead, Susan. Your line is open.
Oh, sorry. I'm trying to do it several ways here. Does EIA still plan to collect sulfur data? I'm just not quite sure how to address that in comments, because even though it's in the Federal Register notice, my understanding was that was something you weren't going to go through with.
So, Susan, we've had a lot of discussion about this, and we did what we call cognitive testing. That is, we go out and actually interview people and say, we'd like to collect this. Can you provide it? And in the cognitive testing, what we discovered on both oil and natural gas, that the ability of respondents to actually provide us with the sulfur data seem to be very limited. And at this point, I mean, I don't want to say absolutely never will we ever ask for that, but we are leaning very, very heavily towards the idea that this is going to be a very difficult thing for producers to do, and we would much rather move forward on the API gravity, which we think is doable, and get that. We are actually asking our statisticians here to have a look at some of the databases that we do have that include both sulfur and gravity to determine if we could get close enough on sulfur with a algorithm, you know, or a regression analysis. If we actually have good data on API gravity, we might be able to impute enough information on sulfur to be able to help us out with what's going on with refining inputs in the U.S. So in a short answer to that one is, at this point, we are not N-O-T, contemplating the sulfur aspect that was in the Federal Register. And that's basically because of the feedback that we've gotten from people who said, look, this is going to be really hard, and you might not get very good data. So we were kind of going, well, what's the point then of that?
Thank you. And I think I also had my hand raised, but that answered my question. Thank you.
Sure. Does anybody out there, I mean, Susan, if you're still, your line is still open, I mean, does that seem to make sense to you all out there? I mean, is there anybody that thinks it's like easy peasy to provide sulfur data?
Quite the contrary. But just as far as where to put our focus, I just didn't want to hammer away at something that you all had wisely considered and decided to not tackle at this point. So it was just more of a way to you know, how to prepare our comments.
Yeah, well, Susan, what folks told us is that, well, of course, sulfur data ultimately gets included in. No refiner is going to buy oil without knowing what the sulfur content is. But that a lot of that apparently happens further downstream from the wellhead, and that trying to match back wellhead with sulfur could prove to be very, very difficult. And that's why we were going the direction that I just said. Back to you, Stephen.
Anything else in the field, Emily?
Right at the moment, I am not seeing. Oh, we just had another hand go up.
Okay.
Bob, I'm going to unmute you.
Hello, this is Bob Wilkinson. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Bob, we can hear you.
Okay. The API gravity, I mean, we definitely, in many cases, the API gravity on produced volumes is not necessarily either timely. It could be based upon well tests that were done maybe at the well's initial production. And so my question is that, you know, does EIA expect, or will they allow some sort of either estimation or approximation of the API gravity based upon maybe some further downstream measurements that are done on a more timely basis?
Hi, Bob. This is Gary. What we were thinking was that when we did this cognitive testing that Adam just talked about on the sulfur question, it came up as well. And what we learned from that was that rather than ask for an API gravity on production, we would ask for the API gravity from your run tickets, which people told us were much more readily available and easier to compile. So your volumes associated with API gravity would be more of a sales volume than a production volume, and I think that'll be just fine.
Okay. Thanks.
You know, again, this is Adam. We're trying to get the best information we can without burdening the system. and what Gary was describing, we think makes more sense. We've heard from a number of people that they think that that kind of approach makes sense, and so we know it's not going to be. It won't be an exact link to wellhead production, but it'll be close enough, I think, to give us a much, much, much better idea than what we have now.
Emily, do we have Susan Ginsburg again?
We do. One moment.
Okay.
My question is, how, I'm sure that, I've heard a lot of IPA members, their opinion would vary depending on whether they're going to be the ones that have to actually do this report. And so is there a way, I guess two questions. One is, when will producers be notified that they are in this, group of companies asked to respond? And then secondly, is there a way for them to kind of, estimate whether they are likely to be included now?
I think that the timing, the plan that's on the table right now for the 914 would be to collect January 2015 data in March. And so probably in the November, December time frame, we would have the sample selected and be sending out notices to people around then, assuming everything goes as planned. And so that's when you should be when you would be notified. And what was the other part of the question?
Is there any way to so the notification? So the first collection would be January data, but it would be March when we're asking for it, and notices would probably go out in November to the respondents that get picked when we do what statisticians call the frame associated with the study. And I think, Gary, the question was, is there any way for somebody to make a guess now as to whether or not they would be included in that extra 250 respondents that we're going to be asking for data?
If you were to look at the production in the states where you operate and look at all the operators in the state and sort them biggest to smallest and come down the list until you got about 85% of production, do that for both oil and gas. And if you're in that group that gives you the 85% production, then you would likely be sampled. But like I said before, we do have that extra limit on the oil production of the 500 barrel a day, so keep that in mind as well.
And I'm pretty sure for confidentiality reasons, we don't actually publish who the current respondents are in the natural gas survey. Am I right about that? We don't actually say who the respondents are.
No.
Right. Gary said no, we don't do that. So we can't give you a list of who the current 240 are in the natural gas survey, because if we did that, we'd be violating the law. And from that standpoint, it'd be hard for us to actually identify, who we think might fall into the next category. But Gary's advice, would be, well, if you're one of the biggest operators in a given state, in any of these 19 states or the Gulf of Mexico, you're likely to be selected. And if you're not one of the biggest operators, it's your chances of being selected are dwindling as you go down the list. I don't know what I'll take a wild stab at this. The 80-20 rule, that we can get 80% of the data with 20% of the respondents or something, and from that standpoint, if you use that kind of a rule within the top couple of states that you're operating in, you might be able to figure out where you would fall on that list.
Emily, any more in the field?
I am not seeing any further questions at this time. Oh, we just had a hand go up.
We just got one.
Bob, it's Bob Wilkinson again.
Okay, yeah, my question this time is that on the API gravity, I noticed that there's quite a few, I don't know what you call them, buckets or categories and ranges, I should say. Is there any consideration to reducing that number, because it seems like there may be more than what's really needed?
I think we were trying to make this easier. We were trying to figure out, that literally from a policy standpoint, from a refining standpoint, you'd probably want to know how much is, you want the light heavy break. From the standpoint of condensates and that whole issue, the gradations, you might want something finer. Starting at, 45 degrees, 50 degrees, 55, 60, the buckets. Gary's kind of shaking his head like maybe he'd like to jump in here and talk about why we picked the buckets we did.
It's pretty much arbitrary at this point. We tried to pick a list of buckets that, if you look at the list, there's 5-degree increments in the higher gravities and 10-degree increments at the lower gravities. And that was specifically to try and address the concern about exports or refining, these lighter oils, things like that.
Congestion in refineries.
Yeah.
If anybody has comments on that and what the administrative issues, reporting issues that you think would be associated with that, please include that in your comments. Either if you want to just send it to us directly, that'd be fine. If you want to enter that in the public record, the Federal Register, it's open until July 7, I believe, for public comment, and we would be happy to and we will read very carefully anything you send us, whether it's directly or through the Federal Register process. I think we are about done here. In closing, let me just say that what I've been trying to do as EIA administrator since I got here 2 years ago is provide more timely information for policymakers to deal with the issues that they've been confronted with, and I think we've been doing a pretty good job at that, and in the same time staying out of trouble, not generating a lot of complaints from either the policymakers themselves or the energy, broadly speaking, but specifically oil and gas respondents that we work with all the time. My watchword is do more of what's working well for everybody and do less of what's not working so well. And we're trying to in a sense, move this data collection process along in that spirit. So we really appreciate you joining us today. We appreciate the questions and comments that you've made. And I promise you that we will look very carefully at everything you had to say as we go through this. So thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today to discuss EIA's proposed changes to our 914 survey. Should you have any follow-up questions regarding this matter, or should you like to learn more about EIA's increased state and intergovernmental outreach efforts and how they can benefit you and your organization, please don't hesitate to contact me at steveazara@eia.gov, AZZARA@eia.gov, at your convenience. Have a wonderful day.